Can you imagine that scene with Peter rebuking Jesus? Now that takes a lot of guts, right? To be rebuking Jesus for anything. And yet, what is it that's the issue? We see that Peter does this rebuke against Jesus, and then Jesus rebukes him back, and has some really very pointed words to speak to Peter about what he's done, but about his perspective in particular. Now, what is it that has created this bit of a rift here? What has Peter implied? He said he's responding to four things that Jesus said would happen to him. These are what Peter's reacting to. Those four things are that Jesus would have to undergo suffering, that he would be rejected by the religious leaders of his day, that he would be executed and die, and that he'd be raised again on the third day. This is what Peter is reacting to, are these four statements. Now, when we look at it from our perspective, we revere Jesus for all of those things, but actually during Peter's day, they were seen as real negatives. In the lens in which the Jewish people of the time looked at the world, these were things that didn't match what success looked like religiously at the time. And so Peter's really reflecting what his culture would say, his Jewish culture would say about what Jesus had proposed. So of these four things, we see the first one was suffering. Well, the Jews of the time, I guess we revere Jesus for his passion, right? The passion of Christ, and we embrace that, and we want to acknowledge that and walk with him through the way of the cross and all those things. But suffering to the Jewish mind at the time of Jesus and Peter would have looked at suffering as being an indication of God's disfavor. That if things were going well with you, it's because you had God's favor, and if things were going badly, it's because you had God's disfavor. And so you see something like the book of Job, and you see that Job, in spite of doing really nothing wrong, all this calamity happens to him, and all of his friends are saying, well, you had to have done something wrong. None of this would have happened unless you had. So that's the first point that Peter's reacting to. The second one is religious leaders. You would think that if Jesus Christ was actually fulfilling all of which the Old Testament trajectory had proposed, that actually he would have the adulation of all of the religious leaders of the time. He had really none of that from any of the major groups in themselves. Maybe some individuals in these groups, but not the groups themselves. He was at odds with all of them. The Zealots, for instance. They wanted to take back their country from the Roman authorities and rule by violent uprising. And Jesus, in fact, he actually defeated Rome, but he didn't do it by violence at all. And so he wasn't matching their particular view of what a Messiah would look like. The Pharisees, who actually were theologically closest to Jesus, had objections to him too, because they were about the letter of the law, doing everything just right, and that would garner God's favor. And we look at Jesus, and he's hanging out with sinners and all sorts of people that they would have nothing to do with, and therefore he disqualified himself in their particular view, in their narrow little world that they had constructed. And the Sadducees and the subgroup of the Herodian party within that objected to Jesus because he was very strong about the fact that their authority was corrupt and illegitimate. And he was very vocal about that, and they didn't like him for that. So none of the major groups were backing him. And yet you would expect that this is Israel's Messiah, they would all be behind him. And so Peter reacts to this. Jesus then says that he's going to die. Peter reacts really strongly to this. Why? Well, we need to know a little bit about the history of the time. Both before Jesus and even to some degree after Jesus, there were reactions, particularly as kind of the zealot-minded people, that were wanting to kick the Romans right out of their land. It was their land, and they were being dominated by the Romans. They wanted to kick them out. So they would have these Messiah figures. That's what they would be called, Messiahs. And they would rise up and they would try to lead a rebellion against the Romans, and they would be just utterly abolished and annihilated when they would try this. And so they would end up killing these Messiahs. And so in the Jewish mind of the time, they would say that a dead Messiah is no Messiah at all. If he's going to end up being dead, he's not going to be able to fulfill anything of what the Messiah is supposed to do. It was not copacetic at all in terms of what they viewed the outcome to be. Resurrection, you think everybody could get behind that, but Peter reacts to this as well. Why would he react to that? Because it didn't match the particular lens of the day. Most of the Jewish groups, with the exception of the Sadducees, actually believed in the resurrection of the body. They believed that at the end of time, God would raise up all the faithful, even physically, resurrect them. So they didn't have a problem with that idea. What didn't match their particular view is for instead of all the faithful at the end of time, we have one person in the middle of time saying they're going to be raised from the dead, and in fact is. It didn't match their particular linear view of how all of this would unfold. And so we see that Jesus, everything he proposed had some cultural objection that could be waged against it. And so when Peter rebukes Jesus for this, he rebukes him back and he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your mind not on the divine things, but on human things." And so what Jesus is saying here, because what Peter and the Jews of the time thought about is that these things have to unfold in a very linear way. We've got to survive. We've got to continue to survive here. We've got to have things going in a straight line without interruption, no hiccups, no bumps in the road. It's got to be a continual unfolding, getting better, and then the glory comes. So anything that has any kind of movement or texture to it was a different lens. And so what Jesus is saying to Peter is you've got to see from a different lens. You're seeing from a human lens that wants everything to just be absolutely straight and smooth without those bumps. Isn't that what most human beings, even in our age, want? We want a life that just goes swimmingly, where there aren't disappointments, and there aren't betrayals, and there aren't hurts, and there aren't sicknesses, and there aren't hardships, there aren't challenges. When everything will just unfold beautifully. And it throws us off when that doesn't happen. But what Jesus is saying is that's a very human way of looking at it. And frankly, life doesn't unfold that way for like anybody. I mean, you can look at anybody's life and it doesn't unfold that way. So maybe there's a different process by which we actually see this world. And that's the view that Jesus is holding up, a different lens, a divine lens. And this different lens is rooted in something a little bit different. And this is expressed by Jesus in John chapter 12, for example, where he says, "Truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." So this is a pattern that we actually, if we pay attention, is a pattern of the world that God has made, of a pattern of coming to life, of a kind of death, and a resurrection into a new and more fruitful place. That's a divine pattern. That's the one that we need to begin to see for ourselves and cooperate with, rather than trying to force this linear view that never works and only gets us frustrated and disappointed. It will not work that way. Let me give you an example of this. There's a book that I read many years ago called Healing Life's Greatest Hurt. And it was by two Roman Catholic brothers who were priests as well, named Dennis and Matthew Lent. And they told an interesting story that during the week, their job was counseling. So they describe in the beginning of this book these people that would come to them for counseling day in and day out during the week. These people were hurt and bruised and broken and having difficulty managing their lives to some degree, trying to sort it out, trying to get some help for moving forward. And they would begin to ask him, well, what do you think contributed to this particular state you find yourself in? And they would say things like, well, you know, I have this broken relationship with a child or a parent, or I went through a divorce and it really just threw me for a loop. Or I've had these health issues that just keep bringing me down. Different things like that. And this would be the things they work on in the counseling. Now, on the weekends, these two brothers would actually run retreats. These were spiritual growth retreats. And they would gather these people together and they'd get in the groups and they would say, these people were happy and they were excited to learn about their faith more deeply and how to live that out and how to continue to have joy. And they would ask them, what do you contribute to the joy that you experience? They said, well, actually, in reality, it's when I realized that I had a broken relationship with my child or my parent. Or it's when I went through that divorce. Or it's when I developed these health issues. And any number of other things exactly like the things that were being presented during the weekdays. Same things. They contributed to growth and health and happiness. The same things. Life was going to bring those things. It's just part of being human. But the lens by which we see those changes everything about what we get out of that. Again, if we continue to try to force a linear view, we will be disappointed. It will not work. But if we listen to Jesus, we listen to God, we look at the pattern of all that God has made and participate with that, then when things come along, as life will bring, and we have a different lens by which we see them and participate with them, then we get something potentially very different out of that. Now, you know, that's just the pattern. I mean, we had the time and had the level of trust that we just were just to, you know, turn the mic off and have a conversation. And each of us could speak freely without, you know, any kind of condemnation or risk. I bet we would hear some things very much like that. That these particular things that I went through have contributed to a wholeness in me, a kind of maturity in me, a new level. Because that's the pattern that God takes all of these things and he puts that seed in the ground and it dies its own death, and yet it is brought back to life in a greater and fuller, more fruitful way. That is the pattern, the lens by which Jesus was asking Peter, his disciples, and us to see our world through. It in fact begins to make all the difference in the world. And so Jesus gets very pointed in this story about what does this look like? And he says, if any of us, if we want to become his followers, then let them deny themselves, take up their cross, which is an instrument of death and annihilation. Take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? That's the pattern. That's the joy of Lent, where we get really serious about that particular thing, where we do look at suffering and being betrayed or rejected or not accepted. And we look at death, even our own death. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We start Lent off with. Remember the cycle that leads to resurrection. You know, the only way to get to resurrection is you have to die. The only way. There's no shortcutting that. There's no jumping over that. It's the only way. And yes, that's the hope that we hold out before us. That is the pattern of life. And the pattern that we embrace once again in Lent. To journey together and remind one another of the pattern. To put those different lenses on. Not the human ones, but the divine ones that see God's marvelous pattern through all creation, through all life, in your life and in mine. We can embrace that and see that kind of transformation, new life, and fruitfulness. May we have the grace to embrace once again that reality. Amen.